On September 2nd, 2024, Tucker Carlson published a controversial podcast clip titled, quote, "Why Winston Churchill Shouldn't Be Seen as a Hero." Tucker talks with a podcaster on why Winston Churchill was not the hero that our textbooks proclaim, but rather a bloodthirsty Zionist warmonger.
But I told him, maybe trying to provoke him a little bit, that I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, he didn't kill the most people. He didn't commit the most atrocities. But I believe, and I think when you really get into it and tell the story right and don't leave anything out, you see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did.
Many people over the last year have responded to it, but I wanted to provide a lengthy, well-edited, and easy-to-understand response to refute many of Darryl Cooper's arguments. The podcast segment begins with Tucker Carlson discussing Darryl Cooper's perspective that we shouldn't view Winston Churchill as a hero, but rather as a flawed man. The problem I have with Darryl Cooper's approach to history is that he presents himself to the layman as an outsider with some uncomfortable truths on history, when in reality, he is simply wrong in his interpretations of Germany and Churchill's actions during World War II. As a result of being anti-Churchill, however, he begins to show empathy for the people Churchill fought against during the Second World War, which rightfully raised a few eyebrows on the internet. Now, I want to get something straight. Being empathetic towards various people who may be perceived as villains in history or discussing culturally sensitive topics can be enjoyable and potentially productive, provided it's handled properly. The problem here is that Mr. Cooper criticizes Churchill for things that are just not reasonable, and he even brings up points out of context to portray Churchill as a warmonger. Cooper, trying to criticize Churchill, seems to empathize with Nazi actions during Operation Barbarossa and just ignores decades of historical consensus, mountains of evidence, and the historical record that contradict his viewpoint. As a result, it comes off as him mischaracterizing the Nazi regime, making them out as sympathetic or reasonable villains. Or perhaps, and I'm not saying that he agrees with this statement, but possibly the good guys. Given Tucker Carlson's sizable audience and the lack of pushback during the podcast, I feel compelled to comment. While I don't want to say that Darryl Cooper is a Nazi apologist, he's making points that one would use to try and justify or at least excuse the killing of millions in the Soviet Union during the events of Operation Barbarossa. This video will be divided into two main parts in which I will lay out Cooper's argument and then refute his points. The first viewpoint of his is on Operation Barbarossa, where he says that the millions killed were due to a lack of planning on the part of the Nazi regime. The second part is his interpretations of Churchill and how it was he and his people, not Hitler, who stood in the way of peace in Europe during 1939 and 1940. I'll also be linking the video in the description in case people think I'm taking his points out of context. I welcome you to watch it for yourself, and without further ado, let's get started. Before we delve into the first point of the video and Darryl Cooper's statements on Operation Barbarossa, some context regarding the conflict is necessary. If you already know a lot about it and just want to skip straight to the counterarguments, you're free to do so. Operation Barbarossa was the German invasion of the Soviet Union, which began in 1941. It's often cited as the largest offensive in human history, solely based on sheer numbers, with the conflict it produced peaking at an estimated 3.5 million Axis soldiers, facing off against 5.5 million Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front. The carnage produced by this conflict left an estimated 8.8 to 10.7 million Soviet soldiers dead, with there roughly being around 14 to 16 million civilians also dead. Out of the 5 million German soldiers who fought and died in World War II, 4 million died on the Eastern Front. Battles like Leningrad and Stalingrad are infamous today due to their high casualty counts and amount of destruction. With the majority of historians today, and therefore the widespread perception by the public as to why Hitler waged this war to begin with, is a deadly cocktail of materialism, genocide, ideology, and paranoia. The reason why it's worth bringing this up is that Darryl Cooper has made very dubious claims about why the conflict started in the first place, as well as why casualty counts are so high.
They launched a war where they were completely unprepared to deal with the millions and millions of prisoners of war, of local political prisoners and so forth that they were going to have to handle. They went in with no plan for that. And they just threw these people into camps, and millions of people ended up dead there. You know, you have like letters as early as July, August 1941 from commandants of these makeshift camps that they're setting up for these millions of people who are surrendering or people they're rounding up. And so it's 2 months after, a month or two after Barbarossa was launched. And they're writing back to the high command in Berlin saying, we can't feed these people. We don't have the food to feed these people. And one of them actually says, rather than wait for them all to slowly starve this winter, wouldn't it be more humane to just finish them off quickly now? And so this is like 2 months into the...
To briefly summarize Darryl Cooper's point was that the Germans launched a war they were not prepared for and didn't account for the number of people they would have to feed during Operation Barbarossa, which then horrifically implies that mercy killings and work, or just concentration camps in general, were, in the eyes of the German army, the only way to morally conduct the invasion while having a lot of occupied civilians. This is ridiculous, but to be briefly charitable to Cooper, I don't doubt that perhaps some Nazi soldiers on the ground were probably concerned about civilian casualties. Still, it doesn't change the fact that the starvation and killing of innocent civilians during Operation Barbarossa was not a result of a lack of planning, but instead an intentional part of Hitler's strategy in the East. To highlight this intentionality, on the 2nd of May, 1941, a month before Operation Barbarossa, 8 Nazi economic officials met in Berlin to discuss the future economic policy of occupied Eastern Europe. Nazi officials had laid out 5 points in the memorandum that they had discussed. The first 3 are the most relevant for today's discussion. Number 1. The war can only continue to be waged if the entire Wehrmacht is fed from Russia during the 3rd year of the war. Number 2. X million people will doubtlessly starve if what is necessary for us to be extracted from the land. 3. Of the greatest importance is the recovery of oilseed, oil cake, and only then grain. The available fat and meat will in all probability be consumed by the troops. As the memorandum points out, not only did Nazi officials understand and predict that millions would die, but they also outlined the confiscation of food from the Soviet Union to the Wehrmacht and Germany in general. As a result, food produced in German-occupied Soviet territories would lead to the starvation and famine of Soviet civilians. The access to this food would thereby help the Germans fight off the British Empire and eventually the Americans. This plan of the Germans starving the Soviets was quite literally known as the Hunger Plan, where they would steal food from an already impoverished Soviet population to try and forcibly starve holdout cities in northern and central Russia. So as one could tell, intentionally starving Soviet civilians was not an accident, but a strategic way for Germany to keep fighting a two-front war. Another component of using starvation against Eastern Europeans was the racial element of his policies. Hitler and his Nazi theorists believed that Slavs could not build any sort of state and were a danger to Western civilization, as they saw that the Soviets stole Western technology and with their abundance of people and resources would overpopulate and overtake Western Europe and destroy Western civilization. Joseph Bendersky puts it best when he states, quote, "Once Russia was defeated, the Nazis would implement their racial plans for the area. Leadership of the Slavic populations of Eastern Europe and Russia would be destroyed immediately. Their land would be seized, and they would become laborers for the Reich. In the long run, some Slavic races would be decimated, while others would be forced to die out because they would be prevented from procreating." But hey, if you don't believe me or the dozens of academics, Hitler also makes it very clear from his own writings in Mein Kampf. I was actually going to read this quote out, but honestly I felt kind of disgusted by it. Hitler's goal for Eastern Europe is obvious, as Hitler wanted to colonize Eastern Europe and kill the majority of the Slavs, but leave enough for enslavement. Therefore, the millions that perished in German-occupied Soviet territories due to starvation were not what Cooper says from a lack of logistics and planning, but served a racial purpose in Hitler's eyes. There was also the ideological component. Hitler in Mein Kampf again says that he thinks that Jews caused the Bolshevik Revolution and that Russians are now subservient to Jewish dictators. Therefore, the term Judeo-Bolshevism was an inaccurate but potent part of German propaganda to demonize the Soviet Union. Consequently, I would say that the invasion of the Soviet Union could have been seen as an ideological crusade by the Germans. Therefore, under Nazi ideology, civilian casualties would have been excused in this circumstance.
Maybe you, as the Germans, you felt like you had to invade to the east. Maybe you thought that Stalin was such a threat, or that if he launched a surprise attack and seized the oil fields in Romania, that you would now not have the fuel to actually respond and you'd be crippled and all of Europe would be under threat. And
Cooper, while perhaps not entirely disagreeing with me, as later he would say that Hitler wanted to ally with Britain and France to destroy the USSR, I would argue that he seemingly seeks to victimize the Germans in this circumstance by using the fear of Soviet attacks in Romania, seizing their essential oil fields, but also by almost framing Operation Barbarossa as a defensive operation. How can one claim that the biggest offensive in history is actually in self-defense? I'm not sure, but this is a rather weak reason. I am sure that some German or other Axis officials were probably paranoid of the vulnerabilities they had on the Soviet border. But to portray this as the main reason why Germany decided to invade the Soviet Union while avoiding the piles of written works made by various academics and the Nazis themselves is ludicrous. This is an example of Cooper taking something that could have some truth to it, but stretching it so far that it becomes disingenuous and downright misleading. Oh, I could honestly end my argument on his view of Operation Barbarossa here. Despite that, because he said that they were apparently quote-unquote unprepared, unquote, to deal with political prisoners, I need to spill another reason why Germans carried on the atrocities they did in the Soviet-occupied territories. And that was to demoralize and disincentivize any sort of resistance the Soviets may have had to German occupation. The German government, through directives such as the Commissar Order and the Einsatzgruppen, once again demonstrated its intent before the invasion. These orders, with many more like it, ordered German soldiers to kill all political officers in the Red Army, as well as any male Soviet Jew who was of draft age, with there also being preemptive pardons of any German soldiers who may have committed these war crimes. They believed that killing these people would stop any form of popular Soviet resistance. Overall, to portray the German army as incompetent and ill-prepared to deal with the Soviet civilian population instead of ideologically motivated soldiers who committed horrific war crimes is misleading, if not downright dangerous. Now finally, onto the Churchill part of this video. Again, we are met with inaccuracies in his interpretations of Churchill and the context surrounding the start of the Second World War.
You know, if you go to 1939, when the Germans and the Soviet Union invade Poland, as soon as that war's wrapped up on the German side, Hitler starts firing off peace proposals to Britain and France because they had already declared war. He didn't expect them to declare war, actually. Like there's a famous scene where he kind of throws a fit when he finds out that they did do that. And so he doesn't want to fight France. He doesn't want to fight Britain. He feels that's going to weaken Europe when we've got this huge threat to the east, the communist threat over there.
To paraphrase here, Cooper states that after the invasion of Poland and its subsequent division between Germany and the Soviet Union, Hitler sent numerous peace proposals to Britain and France, and that Churchill was unreasonable for not accepting them. It's at this point of the video that it's very clear that Cooper is trying to portray Adolf Hitler as a strategist, who reasonably just wants a unified Western Europe against communism. What Cooper fails to mention is that the events leading up to the war, which included German remilitarization, appeasement, and that Churchill, despite being the most vocal, was just one of many British politicians skeptical of Germany's expansion. Again, here is a timestamp if you don't need a rundown on appeasement. The failed strategy of appeasement, pursued by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, is often cited as one of the main reasons leading up to the Second World War. To give some context, after 1933, Germany embarked on a quest for remilitarization and conquest. In 1938, pro-Union or German activists agitated for a referendum in Austria, which Germany had annexed. The same year, there was a new crisis in Central Europe, as Germany also wanted to annex the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Neville Chamberlain, perhaps naively at the time, believed that he could influence Hitler in a way that would not harm British interest in Europe and avoid another large-scale conflict. As a result, he saw negotiating with Germany as a better alternative, seeing as that if war did break out, Britain couldn't offer the Czechs any immediate military assistance. Following the negotiations and agreement, Germany annexed the Sudetenland, and Czechoslovakia remained independent, with the peace being maintained. This was called the Munich Agreement, and this was supposed to secure peace in Europe. Or so they thought.
Within 6 months of declaring that he wanted no more territory anywhere, he violated the Munich Agreement, marched in, and took the whole of the Czech state, though he had specifically promised, "I have no further interest in the Czechoslovakian state. That is guaranteed. We want no Czechs."
However, on March 15, 1939, the Germans annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia, with Chamberlain and many others not considering it a violation of their agreement. To ensure peace with the rest of Germany's neighbors, England, France, and Poland entered into a defensive agreement on August 25, 1939. This agreement stated that if Poland were to be attacked, England and France would come to Poland's aid in the event of war. Less than a week later, however, Germany would invade Poland, with England and France being obliged to join, and the Second World War would start in Europe.
And so Churchill, you have a guy, Churchill wanted a war. He wanted to fight Germany.
While Winston Churchill, rightfully, gets a lot of the credit for being anti-appeasement and anti-Nazi, it is worth noting that many members of Chamberlain's cabinet were also skeptical of Hitler's intentions along the way, even though they ultimately acquiesced to them. For example, Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, after meeting with Hitler in Godesberg, had doubts about whether or not Britain and Nazi Germany could coexist, as Hitler demanded more out of the agreement. Darryl Cooper, the First Lord of the Admiralty, agreed with Winston Churchill that a strong English and French unit was needed to deter Hitler from starting a conflict. I bring this up as one of Cooper's main central arguments, which after the fall of Poland in 1939 and the fall of France in 1940, he presents people like Churchill as the main roadblock to peace. This is because Churchill wanted to continue the war despite having decisively lost in Europe at this point. Appeasement and its failures address these criticisms because the British under Chamberlain had already attempted to extend olive branches to Germany, but Hitler repeatedly broke promises, as seen in the Munich Agreement. Apparent that even if they had wanted to make another futile attempt at peace, which they did, the point was that after the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, the British public at large simply did not view Germany as trustworthy. For example, according to a poll conducted in January 1940, 4 months after the invasion began, British subjects were asked whether or not they approved the British government pursuing peace talks with Germany. 60% of respondents said no, while only 28% said yes. Another question from the same poll that I found interesting was if somebody in your presence suggested that it would be a good idea to have negotiated peace with Germany now, what would you do? 6.75% said it would be a good idea. 21.02% would say nothing. 59.99% would contradict them, and 12.24% would report them to the authorities. Even after the fall of France in 1940, another poll published in 1941 found that only 12.33% of participants would have supported peace with Germany, while 81.68% would have disapproved of it. It should be also pointed out that Great Britain, not the empire, just the island, was a parliamentary democracy, meaning that elected officials had to listen to their constituents and voters. And if the voters wanted war, they would continue it. Winston Churchill didn't have to convince the British public to be against Germany. They were already decisively against them. After all, why pursue peace with a country that keeps breaking its promises? If you were going to use hindsight, Hitler also violated another agreement and backstabbed the USSR in 1941, even though both parties signed the Non-Aggression Pact. So really, if you are quote-unquote pro-peace and anti-communist, your criticism should be aimed at Hitler, seeing as that he was the one that was really bad at honoring agreements and made Europe more divided.
And I think that if there were people in Britain who, if they hadn't put it this way, if they hadn't been so successful at delegitimizing the peace approach by demonizing Neville Chamberlain and so forth and holding him responsible for the invasion of Poland, that people would have been, they would have understood, like, we don't need a repeat of the First World War.
This is a bizarre thing to criticize Churchill and anti-German Brits on because it was Neville Chamberlain who had declared war on Germany, not Churchill. Chamberlain himself admits defeat when it comes to his appeasement policy in his war declaration on Germany.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. You can imagine what a bitter blow it is to me that all my long struggle to win peace has failed.
Chamberlain also states in the same speech that he once again attempted to negotiate with Hitler to maintain peace, but was rejected. Now, after Poland was conquered, just about a month later, Hitler conveniently wanted peace. Keep in mind, Churchill wasn't even prime minister yet, because he had achieved his primary goal, which was the annexation of Western Poland. An article published by Time magazine on October 16, 1939, said that Hitler justified his conquests by calling Poland, a British ally by the way, a lapdog of Western democracies and an abortion of the Treaty of Versailles. Meaning that Hitler was not even all that sorry about conquering Poland in the first place. Expecting the British Empire, a world superpower, just to keep bending over backwards even after trying to accommodate Hitler is a fantasy.
The reason I resent Churchill so much for it is that he kept this war going when he had no way to go back and fight this war. All he had were bombers. He was literally, by 1940, sending bomber fleets to go firebomb the Black Forest, just to burn down sections of the Black Forest. Just rank terrorism, going through and starting to, what eventually became just the carpet bombing, the saturation bombing of civilian neighborhoods.
As if, Germany wasn't doing the same thing. Now, the following point Cooper brings up is that he feels that Churchill is evil and made civilians needlessly suffer, as the British Empire had no real way of fighting Germany on the ground at this point in Europe. This is just another example of Cooper trying to victimize Germany in this respect, acting like the British or Churchill had no reason to pursue war with Germany. There could have been peace, guys, just trust me. This time I'll follow the peace agreement. If you want to play ball, I'll play ball. Want to talk about British war atrocities against the Germans? I'll bring up German war atrocities against the British. The Blitz began on September 7th, 1940, and lasted till May 1941, ending with 43,500 people in Britain being killed, with more being injured and made homeless. Some of the bombing was so ruthless on the part of the Germans that a small town named Coventry had 503 tons of highly explosive bombs dropped on it, with 30,000 incendiary bombs also being dropped. The injuries and killings were so widespread in the town that everyone knew at least one person who was seriously impacted by these events. And the Germans coined a new verb called Covenantrieren, or to coventrate, which just describes the amount of damage done to the small town. Now, granted, this town did make munitions, so you could make the argument that specific parts of the city were not peaceful. They were a part of the war machine. Still, my point is that indiscriminate bombing happened everywhere in World War II, and to blame the British for doing the same thing is incredibly hypocritical. So overall, yeah, dude, war is hell. Maybe Hitler shouldn't have started it. Now, he brings up the fact that the UK had propaganda and media operations in the United States to try and convince the Americans to go to war with Germany. I don't doubt this, but he's making this seem like a conspiracy theory, as if that was the reason why America joined in World War II. While conveniently not remembering Pearl Harbor was probably a much bigger reason, there is also the fact that Germany was the one that declared war on America first, not the other way around. I mean, for Christ's sakes, Germany really walked into that one.
And that was his whole plan. His whole plan was we don't have a way to fight this war ourselves. This war is over. We need either the Soviet Union or the United States to do it for us, and that was the plan, and kept the war going long enough for that plan to come to fruition. And to me, it's a craven, ugly way to fight a war.
Why? Why was it craven? Why is this even a bad thing? Britain did this with Napoleon. I don't see why this is a problem this time. As I pointed out before, the British public, as well as many politicians, had no reason to believe that Hitler wouldn't backstab them again. If anything, it was a smart move, especially in hindsight, to play the long game. Hitler screwed himself anyway by invading the Soviet Union, and FDR had a lot of sympathies with the British, with Lend-Lease giving Britain essential wartime goods and eventually joining the war. So all I have learned from this is that Churchill outplayed Hitler, and some people just can't accept that. Now, for the rest of the clip, he tries to psychoanalyze Winston Churchill by saying that, he played with toys, he was crazy, a drunk, and led a failed attack on Gallipoli, and that was why he wanted war. It was to redeem himself. It's just a bunch of stuff that isn't relevant to the topic. Listen, Churchill was not a perfect person. I'm going to make some British nationals mad at me and say that he wasn't even a good person. There is so much you can criticize Churchill for. When I was first recommended this video by some people, I legitimately thought he was going to bring up, I don't know, like the Bengal famine, the fact that he was an imperialist, the cog in the British machine. You could criticize him for partially being responsible for the Israel-Palestine conflict that we still see today. Talk to anyone from Africa or South Asia, and they can give you a lot of really valid reasons to hate Churchill. Despite that, Darryl Cooper criticizes Churchill for some of the most ahistorical reasons. Even as someone like me, who has a love-hate relationship with Churchill, I have to give it up to the man and the British people for standing up against Nazi Germany when it was tough to do. Churchill was anti-Nazi right from the beginning. He criticized Neville Chamberlain when it might have been politically unpopular to do so. I'd recommend reading Winston Churchill's speech, Disaster of the First Magnitude, in which he lambasts the Chamberlain establishment for selling out Czechoslovakia and advocates for the political rights of people living in Czechoslovakia. It's good stuff. The main issue I have with Darryl Cooper and his analysis of Winston Churchill is his misrepresentation and straight-up refusal to acknowledge certain aspects of the historical timeline, as well as characteristics of Operation Barbarossa. The fact that he chalked up the millions of dead in the Soviet Union as a lack of planning, when there's ample evidence to the contrary. I mean, researching this video wasn't even all that difficult, as Hitler and the Nazis wrote down their intentions to begin with. Not to mention, this is one of the most well-researched topics in history. So there is no excuse for it. If I'm being charitable with Cooper, I can perhaps say that sometimes he says something with a kernel of truth, but then he stretches it to a point where it becomes unbelievable. I don't want to believe that he's a Nazi apologist. Perhaps he's just uninformed, and I hope that's the case, but at the same time, how much of what he can say can be truly chalked up to ignorance? Earlier, I mentioned that you can criticize Winston Churchill's policy on what was, at the time, the Zionist-Palestinian conflict for being pro-Zionist or later pro-Israeli. Cooper, I would argue, implies that because of that, Zionists used Churchill's hatred of Germany as a means to propel him to power.
This way, I think his hostility to Germany was real. I don't think that he necessarily had to be bribed to have that feeling. But, I think he was, to an extent, put in place by people, the financiers, by a media complex that wanted to make sure that he was the guy who was representing Britain.
This is fairly typical for an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Rather than examining Germany's actions during the interwar period or British sentiment as a reason for Britain's decision to go to war with Germany, Cooper instead flirts with the idea that there were these people in the financial and media institutions, and that's the reason why he came to power. This all screams to me that this is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, Rothschild type of stuff, which hopefully has been proven by this point to be completely and entirely incorrect. Jewish people being Jewish or Zionist had no impact on Britain staying in the war. I would like to conclude this video by sharing my overall thoughts on the interview. Before Tucker Carlson fans want to go after me and say that I am pro-censorship and that this guy, even if he's wrong, should be allowed to say what's on his mind, I am right there with you. I don't mind journalists interviewing controversial people, whether it be terrorists, dictators, authoritarians, and I guess, to be charitable, in this case a contrarian. My problem is that Tucker Carlson, aside from occasionally asking a couple of questions, offered this guy no pushback on the topic. There was no correction of the record, nor was there any argument or debate. Tucker just allowed this individual to spread misinformation, which is disgusting, and it's not even the first time he's done this either. But hey, Tucker Carlson is not precisely known for journalistic integrity anyway, so, If you made it to this part of the video, thank you. Some of you might be taken aback by this, as 5 years ago I used to create gaming content. However, as you can see, this marks a change in direction for my channel, and for that, I apologize. Overall, this video means that I am coming out of retirement. If you come across any videos on the internet that seem incorrect or historically inaccurate, please send them to me, and I may create a video on it. Once again, thank you, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Ciao.